If now as well. Okay. And I'm just going to start it now. All right, bye.
Right. Good evening, everybody. We're very delighted to have Ian Spencer with us once again, giving us his knowledge and wisdom on the question of why Marx. And tonight, he's going to be looking at why the UK has never produced a mass revolutionary Marxist party. He's also going to be looking at Marx and Engels and the British unions and the predecessors of the Labour Party, the ILP, the LRC, SDF, and Socialist League. So I'll say no more, but hand over to Ian.
Is that sharing? You see that?
Yep, we can see. Yeah, we can see your presentation.
That's it. Good evening, comrades. Those of you who have been absolutely enthralled at the Labour Party conference will enjoy the vision of lots of union flags and not much evidence of what we might call socialism. And of course, what we often find is about this time, lots of people on the left scream and shout about the betrayal of the Labour Party of any kind of idea around a socialist idea, or even a close relationship with the trade unions. What I'm going to suggest is that the Labour Party doesn't engage in a betrayal of socialism, but that it has never been socialist from its inception. In looking at the history of the Labour Party and its relationship to not only its own founders, but to Marx, Engels, Eleanor Marx, who played an important role, what we'll see is that, in fact, if anything, the British Labour movement has historically started off as the tail end, really, of the Liberal Party and of what one might call liberal radicalism. And the trajectory followed by the Labour Party, whether it's towards nationalisation rather than the common ownership of the means of production, is an intrinsic part of the early founders of the Labour Party. So the picture you see here is the famous picture taken of the Chartists meeting on Kennington Common in 1848. Frederick Engels, of course, was in London about this time, and as it were, caught the tail end of the of what had been a reawakening of the Chartist movement in 1848. And it's interesting as well that if you go through the collected works of Marx and Engels and look for references to the British trade union movement, it's quite often Engels that writes upon it, which is understandable. They had a kind of division of labour between them, where Marx was concentrating on economic studies and philosophy and so on. Engels, of course, as a factory manager in Manchester, had a great deal of contact with the British workers' movement from the other side of the fence, and also as a well-informed commentator and revolutionary. So in the condition of the working classes in England, Engels appears to be is pretty critical of the trade union movement in Britain. The trade union movement in Britain, having evolved, as it were, early on, arguably some of the craft unions were related to, had a historical background in guilds, and what Marx and Engels saw during the course of their lifetime was the development of a new unionism, general workers' unionism, which by the 1880s was producing significant differences in the old unions, as it were, that were rooted in the protection of craft union members' particular interests against competition. And so in 1845, in The Condition of the Working Class in England, Engels says, but what gives these unions and their strikes arising from them their real importance is this: they are the first attempt of the workers to abolish competition, that is to say, competition among the working class for scarce jobs and later other services too. In the context of Britain in the 1840s, he doesn't have a high regard for those he regards as socialists or regarded themselves as socialists. Socialists, he says, are thoroughly tame and peaceable, accept our existing order, bad as it is, so far as to reject all other methods, but that of winning public opinion. And this then is the beginning of a theme which I would argue comes down to the present, the idea that somehow trades disputes are won by maintaining popular public support rather than by changing anything to do with the way in which the surplus is extracted from the working population. By 1888, 1889, and the Great Dock Strike, I mean, there's a good example there in the context of the dock workers in 1889. Before the strike, workers simply had to stand outside the docks in the hope of picking up some from casual labour as each day went by. And they were often the poorest in one of the poorest parts of London in the East End and around the docks. Many men were so hungry they could only work for a short period of time and take whatever pay they could in order to feed themselves. So under the leadership of Tom Mann, Ben Tillett and so on, and others who I'll come on to shortly, the dock strike was a great success and started to show the possibility of what trade unions could do in terms of not only winning gains for their members, but potentially posing a challenge to the ruling class itself. Marx has this to say in his essay, lecture really, on wages, price and profit. Wages, price and profit was delivered as a lecture to the First International, and it's an important piece of work, and it's a very useful starting point for those who want to read Capital. So at the end of one of the chapters, he says on the trade unions, instead of the conservative motto, a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, they ought to inscribe on their banner the revolutionary watchword, abolition of the wages system. Just out of idle curiosity, I started to flick through some of the trade union websites before presenting this, and look at the Royal College of Nursing website, look at a whole range of different unions websites. The talk is of fair pay. Marx here is arguing for the abolition of the wages system, and most of the trade unions have in fact never done anything more than haggle over the price at which workers are exploited, rather than ever challenging the exploitation of the working class. And this was one of the principal divisions between Marx and Engels and some of the other members, for example, of the Social Democratic Federation, which I'll come on to in a moment. And one of the other great divisions, of course, was participation in Parliament. The Social Democratic Federation, originally founded as simply the Democratic Federation, it became the Social Democratic Federation in 1887. So founded in 1881, it had some interesting members. These are not the only ones, but I've taken a brief selection, just to give you an illustration of what the background was to one of the organisations which went on subsequently to make up part of the early Labour Party. Henry Hyndman, I'm going to talk about more in a moment, but it's fair to say at this stage that Marx detested Henry Hyndman on a personal level as well as a political one. He regarded him as little more than a kind of political chancer, as it were, whose sole interest was in gaining a place in Parliament for himself predominantly, and was entirely concerned with electoral politics to the exclusion of working with trade unions. Hyndman also annoyed Marx personally as he plagiarized his work. Hyndman, as we'll see, produced a number of books which lifted tracts, often distorted them and passed them off as his own work without any kind of reference to Marx whatsoever. James Connolly, I'm not going to talk a lot about because I want to come back to him more when we talk about syndicalism in a few weeks' time. However, most of you will, of course, know of James Connolly as the leader of the Easter Uprising in Dublin in 1916. But Connolly was briefly a member of the Social Democratic Federation and lots of other organisations as well. The reason why I'm going to talk about him in the context of syndicalism is that for a while he was in the United States and was a member of the International Industrial Workers of the World, the Wobblies. And he was an associate of Daniel de Leon. And in that context, I think it's worth talking about Connolly under syndicalism, although, of course, Connolly is a fairly complex figure and deserves a session on his own, which he has had in this group at different times when we were doing, for example, the lives of the left. Coming then on to Eleanor Marx, I'll mention her a bit here and then a bit more later. Eleanor Marx is typically known as Karl Marx's youngest daughter, but that overlooks her quite enormous contribution in her own right. She had a hand in translating Capital, Volume 1, along with her husband. They were never formally married, but her husband, Edward Aveling. And she made a number of other very important contributions, which I'll talk about more in a moment. And William Morris. William Morris today, of course, is largely thought of as a printmaker, the originator of lots of nice patterns of wallpaper and dress material for beloved of middle-class people everywhere. And a kind of leading figure in the arts and crafts movement. It's interesting that somebody who was politically radical, as it were, albeit in a rather strange way, was so conservative aesthetically. Most of his aesthetic work, most of his artistic works, were concerned with trying to reclaim as almost a golden age of the past, so a period looking back to the medieval period, looking back to the Elizabethan period, and trying to recreate old craft forms in opposition to the mass production that poor people had to put up with. William Morris himself was, as it were, on the left of the Social Democratic Federation, but that, in a sense, doesn't say a great deal, in that later on he tended to affiliate more with the anarchist side of the Socialist League, which split away from the Social Democratic Federation. George Lansbury was an interesting character because he was one of the few, in a sense, that we would have regarded himself perhaps as firmly on the left. He had he was for a brief period led the Labour Party after the period in which the Labour Party formed the national government in coalition with the Conservative Party in 1931, and he led the rump group of the Parliamentary Labour Party, while Herbert Morrison led the party as a whole. It was interesting in other ways. He supported the Russian Revolution. He opposed participation in the First World War. He was actively in favour of women's suffrage, and he represented a part of the left of the Labour Party, which is largely overlooked today. Tom Mann, some of you will know, was a leader along with Ben Tillett of the dock strike of 1889. And of all the people that Engels refers to, Tom Mann comes out as one that's held in higher regard, although Engels expresses his frustration that Tom Mann could get excited about the fact that he was going to be having dinner with the Lord Mayor on a particular day. So you see this frustration in Engels and Marx of the tendency on the part of the British Labour movement to be somewhat fawning towards members of authority, and the Social Democratic Federation as a whole were not particularly supported by Marx and Engels, largely because of the detestation of Henry Heinemann, to which I'll now turn. Heinemann himself occupies quite a lot of ire on the part of Marx and Engels. He himself was a conservative son of a wealthy businessman. He graduated from Trinity College, Cambridge. He was a very much a conservative figure. One might suggest that might say that there was an element of the kind of radical liberalism about him, but initially he became a socialist after reading a novel by Ferdinand Lassalle, and then subsequently the Manifesto of the Communist Party. England for All was a book he wrote in 1881, which widely plagiarized both the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, and wrote a number of other books, which the interesting thing about them was that they were very popular, which annoyed Marx even more, I suspect. That along with people like Jules Guide, I mentioned last week in the context of the French Party, Heinemann had a capacity for popularizing stuff to a wide audience. But if you look at it carefully, it's often a bowdlerized version of Marx. It's a bowdlerized version of socialist ideas. And he was also a kind of admirer, for example, of Giuseppe Mazzini, who was an Italian nationalist, who, unlike Giuseppe Garibaldi, was fairly right-wing, really, and Mazzini famously opposed Marx in the context of the First International. By contrast, Giuseppe Garibaldi was a member of the First International Working Men's Association. Heinemann was also thoroughly anti-Semitic, exactly what one might call the socialism of fools, where he expressly kind of tended to refer to Jewish capital as if somehow that made capital somehow worse, the fact that it was Jewish capital. And he was also a pretty principled supporter of British imperialism. He had no interest whatsoever in the effect that the British Empire was having on peoples around the world. The left eventually split from the Social Democratic Federation to form the Socialist League. Among the many things that Henry Heinemann annoyed people by was that he actually took money from the Conservative Party to the tune of about 340 quid in order to found Social Democratic Federation candidates. And of course, the Conservatives' interest in this was absolutely crystal clear. They wanted Social Democratic Federation candidates to stand against liberals in areas where there would otherwise be a straight fight between Tories and liberals, and therefore allowing the Tories to win. And Heinemann took the money and fell for it, despite the fact that none of his candidates that he put up actually got more than, well, one candidate got a few hundred votes and the others got votes in their tens, and it was one of the many aspects which Marx saw in Heinemann an unprincipled opportunist, somebody who was only really interested in politics from the point of view of it being a career for him. His legacy, if he has one at all, is that the Socialist Party of Great Britain, which was founded in 1911, out of the kind of shattered remnants of the Social Democratic Federation, absolutely, even to this day, refuses to have a leader as such because of the pernicious effect of Henry Heinemann. He was regarded as being a kind of thoroughly dictatorial leader and wanted to run it as a kind of personal fiefdom, as it were. And so in 1884, the left split to form the Socialist League. And here you see the arts and crafts influence on the Socialist League. So some curious characters here that probably people, I mean, I had never heard of Ernest Belfort Bax until I went to university. And the only reason why I'd heard of Ernest Belfort Bax then was because one of my lecturers had done quite a lot of research and published a very expensive book on Ernest Belfort Bax. Ernest Belfort Bax was an interesting character insofar as he had gone to Germany in 1879 to study music, having come from a fairly well-off background. And obviously becoming fluent in German, became very interested in German philosophy. He didn't really succeed as a musician, but became one of the few intellectuals in the British left to have any kind of schooling in Hegel, Kant, and various others. But the interesting thing about it was that he wanted to have a kind of Hegelian socialism. He didn't want the materialism that Marx put forward. So once again, we see this recurring figure, this recurring feature in socialist parties, where a bowdlerized, stunted version of Marx was being presented in a populist way, and often in a way which was, to say the least, not really fully in accord with what Marx was arguing, as we'll go on to see, typically arguing in favor of cooperatives rather than the idea of the common ownership of the means of production, often arguing in favor of nationalization rather than the common ownership of the means of production, as if they were somehow the same thing. Returning then to William Morris, I mean, one of the things that was important about Morris was effectively he was bankrolling the Socialist League, the newspaper of the Socialist League, the Commonweal, which published a number of very influential articles. Eleanor Marx, for example, had a regular column in